For nearly 30 years, one voice has defined what it means to walk into the Potter's house in Dallas, Texas. One man built a congregation from 50 displaced families into a 30,000-member global institution, turned his sermons into some of the most quoted lines in modern Black church history, and became, by almost any measure, one of the most influential preachers alive. That man is Bishop T.D. Jakes, and in 2025, in front of his own congregation, he did something almost no leader of an institution that large ever willingly does. He stepped down. Not because he was pushed out, not because of scandal, but because of a health scare that forced him to confront his own mortality on a stage in front of thousands of people, live, on camera. What followed was one of the most carefully orchestrated leadership transitions in modern megachurch history, a plan that had reportedly been years in the making, culminating in his own daughter and son-in-law taking the pulpit he built. Today, we're breaking down exactly how this transition happened, what triggered it, who's taking over, and what Potter's House to. Zero actually means for the future of one of the most powerful ministries in the country. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to go back to where the Potter's House actually started. It wasn't always a Dallas institution. Back in 1996, T.D. Jakes relocated from West Virginia to Dallas with roughly 50 families who'd been part of his previous ministry, taking over a facility that had originally belonged to a different televangelist. From that 50-family foundation, Jakes built something almost unrecognizable in scale. Within just a few years, the Potter's House was holding multiple services every Sunday to accommodate tens of thousands of worshipers, eventually becoming one of the largest and most recognized megachurches in the entire country, with a television ministry that carried Jakes' sermons into homes across the world. For 3 decades, Jakes wasn't just the pastor of a large congregation. He became a cultural figure in his own right, a best-selling author, a filmmaker, a conference circuit headliner whose Woman Thou Art Loosed brand became a movement of its own, reaching far beyond the walls of any single church building. Now fast forward to November 2024, the moment that changed everything. During a live Sunday morning service in front of his own congregation and cameras, Bishop Jakes suffered a heart attack right there on the platform. It's the kind of moment that for most public figures would happen behind closed doors, but because it occurred mid-service, it became a deeply public, deeply vulnerable event that congregants and, eventually, the wider public witnessed almost in real time. Jakes survived, and in the months that followed, he spoke about the experience in strikingly honest terms, describing it at one point as a life-threatening calamity and telling his congregation he considered himself a walking miracle. But the incident clearly reshaped how he thought about his own future, and more importantly, about the future of the institution he'd spent nearly 30 years building. In his own words to his congregation, he said he could not afford, especially after what happened in November, to risk something happening to him again and leave the church without a shepherd in place. That statement is the key to understanding everything that came next, because what Jakes revealed in the months following his health scare wasn't a hastily assembled emergency plan. It was the acceleration of a succession strategy that, according to Jakes himself, had already been more than 6 years in the making. In April of 2025, during another emotional Sunday service in Dallas, Jakes stood before his congregation and announced that he would be stepping down from his role as senior pastor, and that leadership of the Potter's House would pass to his daughter, Pastor Sarah Jakes Roberts, and her husband, Pastor Tour Roberts. He framed the decision not as retreat, but as wisdom, telling the congregation directly that he had watched too many leaders build something remarkable and then stay in place so long that they ultimately damaged what they'd built. It's a strikingly self-aware statement for a man at the absolute height of his platform and influence to make about himself. And it's part of why this transition drew so much attention across the religious world. Succession in megachurch culture is notoriously difficult. Plenty of ministries built entirely around one dominant personality have fractured, shrunk, or collapsed entirely once that founder stepped away, precisely because no real plan existed for what came next. Jake seemed determined not to let that happen to his own legacy. So, who exactly are Sarah Jakes Roberts and Tour Roberts, the two people now carrying that legacy forward? This wasn't some sudden appointment of unqualified relatives, and it's worth taking a moment to actually look at the track record both of them brought into this role. Sarah Jakes Roberts has spent years building her own independent platform within ministry, most visibly through Women Evolve, a movement and annual conference she launched in 2022 that grew into one of the most attended women's faith gatherings in the country, drawing tens of thousands of attendees and establishing her as a major voice in her own right, separate from her father's shadow. Tour Roberts, meanwhile, built his own reputation as founding pastor of the Potter's House at 1LA, a Los Angeles campus he grew from the ground up into a thriving, culturally influential congregation, along with helping lead the church's expansion efforts into Denver. In other words, by the time this transition became official, both Sarah and Tour had already spent years proving they could build and sustain ministries on their own, not simply inherit one. That track record appears to have mattered deeply in how the succession plan was structured. The two were formally installed as assistant pastors of the Potter's House back in 2023, a full 2 years before the official handoff, giving them time to work directly alongside Jake's inside the actual operations of the church before ever stepping into the senior role. The official installation itself took place on July 6, 2025, timed deliberately to coincide with the church's 29th anniversary celebration, a symbolic choice that framed the moment not as an ending, but as a continuation of the same institutional story. During that service, Tour and Sarah were formally installed as co-senior pastors of the Potter's House, taking over full pastoral leadership of a congregation of more than 30,000 members. In their own public statements, both were careful to frame the moment around continuity rather than reinvention for its own sake. Tour Roberts said publicly that their commitment was to build a ministry that carries the heart of Bishop Jakes forward into a future that remains both faithful to that foundation and forward-thinking in how it serves people. That balancing act, honoring 3 decades of tradition while still evolving for a dramatically different cultural and digital landscape, has become the defining challenge of what the church itself has started branding as Potter's House 2.0. And it's worth being specific about what that phrase actually means in practice, rather than treating it as just a marketing tagline. The next generation vision being rolled out under Sarah and Tour's leadership leans heavily into multi-generational discipleship, meaning ministry programs explicitly designed to serve congregants across dramatically different life stages and age groups under one unified church identity, rather than just the traditional Sunday morning-focused model. It also leans hard into digital-first ministry infrastructure, recognizing that a huge portion of the church's actual audience now experiences the Potter's House primarily through live streams, apps, and social platforms rather than physically sitting in the sanctuary in Dallas. The church has continued expanding its Discipleship Institute and broader Potter's House Global Network, initiatives aimed at training leaders and extending the church's reach and educational offerings well beyond the physical Dallas campus. It's a strategy that acknowledges something most legacy megachurches have struggled with for years, that the audience which grew up on cable television broadcasts of Sunday sermons looks nothing like the audience that discovers a ministry today through a 15-second clip on social media. Meanwhile, Bishop Jakes himself didn't disappear from the picture, and that distinction matters. He didn't retire in the traditional sense of stepping away from public life entirely. Instead, he transitioned into the role of chairman of the board, continuing to serve as a spiritual overseer and providing what the church has described as ongoing legacy guidance to Sarah, Tour, and the broader executive ministry team. He also remains deeply active outside the pulpit through the TD Jakes Group, which encompasses his real estate ventures, his broader business enterprises, and the TD Jakes Foundation, continuing work focused on community development, job creation, and economic opportunity. He's also expanded into media in new ways, including a partnership with iHeartMedia to launch a slate of podcast programming. In interviews and public statements, Jakes has framed this next chapter of his own career around addressing what he calls some of the more urgent structural challenges of this era, specifically pointing to the shrinking of the American middle class, social unrest, and closing gaps in opportunity. Issues he says he now has more freedom to focus on precisely because he's no longer carrying the full weekly operational and pastoral load of a 30,000-member congregation. It's also worth pausing on just how unusual it is for a church of this size to have two senior pastors sharing the title equally, rather than simply promoting one successor. The co-senior pastor model that Sarah and Tour now operate under isn't the traditional structure most megachurches use, where one dominant figure holds ultimate authority and everyone else operates underneath them. Instead, the church has structured this transition around a genuine partnership, a husband and wife team sharing full pastoral authority together, which mirrors the way they'd already been co-leading campuses in Los Angeles and Denver before ever coming to Dallas. That structure is itself a quiet signal about where the church's culture is heading, away from the singular icon model that defined so much of 20th century American televangelism and toward something that looks more like shared, collaborative leadership. It also means the pressure of carrying a 30,000-member institution and a decades-old brand doesn't rest on one person's shoulders alone, which, given how publicly and physically Bishop Jakes' own body gave out under that pressure in November 2024, may turn out to be one of the most consequential decisions in the entire transition. There's also a financial and operational dimension to this handoff that's easy to overlook if you only focus on the emotional Sunday morning footage. The Potter's House isn't just a church. It's a sprawling institution with television production, a publishing arm, multiple physical campuses across different cities, large-scale annual conferences, and a global media footprint that reaches audiences across the world. Handing over senior pastoral leadership of something that size isn't comparable to a small congregation naming a new preacher. It's closer to a founder-led company transferring operational control of a major organization, complete with staff, budgets, media contracts, and brand partnerships that all have to keep functioning seamlessly through the transition. That's part of why the 2-year runway as assistant pastors mattered so much. Sarah and Tour weren't just shadowing Jake spiritually, they were reportedly getting direct exposure to the actual machinery running behind the pulpit. The parts of running a megachurch that never make it into a Sunday broadcast. It's also worth noting how this transition fits into a broader pattern playing out across American megachurch culture right now, where a first generation of founder pastors who built their platforms in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s are now reaching an age where succession isn't hypothetical anymore. It's immediate and unavoidable. Plenty of those transitions have gone badly. Congregations have split, attendance has collapsed, and in some of the most painful cases, entire ministries have unraveled within a few years of a founder stepping away, precisely because there was no real infrastructure in place to survive a change in leadership. Religious sociologists who study megachurch culture have pointed to this exact vulnerability for years, warning that ministries built around a single charismatic personality often struggle to translate that same connection and trust to a successor, no matter how qualified that successor might be on paper. The Potter's House transition is being watched closely across the broader faith world precisely because it appears to be trying to solve that problem deliberately, rather than waiting to see if the bond between congregation and new leadership simply happens on its own. Then came the milestone that tied this entire story together. In July of 2026, the Potter's House marked its 30th anniversary, 3 full decades since Jake's first arrived in Dallas with those original 50 families. The anniversary celebration became more than a simple commemoration of the church's history. It became a symbolic bookend to the entire transition story, a moment where the congregation could look back on 3 decades built almost entirely around one man's voice and vision, while simultaneously looking forward into an era being actively shaped by the next generation of leadership. Church programming around the anniversary explicitly framed it around honoring, in the church's own words, 3 decades of faith, family, and transformation, language that deliberately links Jake's original founding vision with the future Sarah and Tour are now tasked with building. Why does any of this actually matter beyond the walls of one church in Dallas? Because succession is arguably the single hardest problem in the entire landscape of American megachurch ministry, and most institutions get it catastrophically wrong. Time and again, we've watched congregations built around one singular, charismatic founder struggle to survive that founder's retirement, death, or scandal, because there was never a real plan, never a transition period, never a next generation given the actual operational experience needed to inherit something that large. What makes the Potter's House situation genuinely notable within that landscape is the sheer intentionality of the process. This wasn't an emergency scramble following a health crisis, even though that health crisis clearly accelerated the timeline. According to Jake's own account, and according to church leadership, this was a strategy that had already been developing for roughly 6 years before it became public, with Sarah and Tour given real, visible leadership roles, running their own campuses and their own major initiatives, years before ever being installed as senior pastors. That kind of long runway is rare in ministry succession, and it's part of why religious leadership experts and commentators across the country have pointed to this transition as a potential model for how other large founder-dependent institutions might eventually need to plan their own futures. There's also something worth sitting with in how publicly vulnerable this entire process was allowed to be. A heart attack, live on a church stage, in front of a congregation and cameras, could easily have been treated as a private medical matter kept entirely out of public view. Instead, Jakes chose to speak about it directly and repeatedly, using his own mortality as the explicit, stated reason behind accelerating a succession plan most leaders would rather avoid discussing at all. That kind of transparency, whether you view it as smart institutional stewardship or simply an unavoidable reality given how public the original incident was, has reframed how this transition gets talked about. It's not just a story about who's taking over a pulpit. It's a story about a man publicly reckoning with his own limits and choosing, deliberately, to hand off something he spent 30 years building while he still had the ability to guide that handoff himself, rather than leaving it to chance. So where does that leave the Potter's house heading forward from here? Sarah Jakes Roberts and Tor Roberts now carry full senior pastoral responsibility for one of the largest, most influential congregations in the country, backed by years of hands-on ministry experience of their own. An explicit long-term strategic vision branded around evolution rather than replication, and a founder who remains present, active, and engaged, just no longer carrying the daily operational weight himself. The coming years will be the real test of whether Potter's House 2.0 can actually deliver on its stated vision, expanding discipleship models, deepening digital reach, and staying relevant to a generation of believers whose relationship with church looks dramatically different than it did in 1996. But if the deliberateness of this transition is any indication, this wasn't a leadership team improvising under pressure. It was, by every available account, a plan 30 years and 6 years in the making, finally set into motion. What do you think this next chapter means for the future of megachurch leadership more broadly? And do you think other major ministries will start following this same model of long-term, intentional succession planning? Let us know in the comments, and if you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories shaping faith and culture today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.